the Florida Writer Podcast, a discussion about writing and other things.
Hello, and welcome to another edition of the Florida Writer Podcast with your host, Alison Nissen. And today I am lucky enough to be with Cooper Levey-Baker. Cooper, could you please give us a 60-second elevator pitch about who you are and what you write?
Hi, thanks you so much for having me. I'm a writer in Sarasota, Florida, and I've been a journalist in Sarasota for about 15 years. But I recently published my first novel. It's called Dead Fish Wind, and it came out in January. And it's sort of kind of dark and grim, but supposed to be funny. It's about a young woman who is kind of stuck in this kind of life of drudgery, and she's trying to escape it in this kind of dystopian Florida town that's hit with a catastrophic outbreak of red tide. And so she's kind of battling to kind of escape her fate. And she, to do so, she kind of makes this new friend that she links up with, who is also working with this outlaw doula who is selling stolen placentas from a local hospital. So it's kind of absurd, funny, a little dark, a little grim, bizarre, kind of a coming of age story, I guess I would describe it as.
For those people that don't live in Florida, could you describe a red tide?
Sure. So red tide, it's been around forever. It's not like a new phenomenon. Even centuries ago, people were recording it. Basically, it's a toxic algae that lives primarily in the Gulf of Mexico, and it kills fish. So it kind of bubbles up and kind of kills fish, and then the fish end up washing up on the beach. Other animals are consuming the toxic fish, so they die as well. And red tide itself, is a naturally occurring phenomenon, but it's fed by runoff from human activity on the ground, and it kind of ends up out in the Gulf. So even though it's not caused by humans, human activity definitely has a strong impact on it. And it's been a big issue down here in Florida for years. Most recently, there was a really catastrophic outbreak just last year that was caused by a disaster here in Manatee County, where they had to release a ton of toxic water to prevent gypsum stack, gypsum stack from collapsing. And all that nutrients and stuff like that builds up in that water just feeds the red tide. And I'd written about red tide many years ago, and I was always interested in it. And so my idea for the book was sort of like to take a typical kind of red tide outbreak, but just really crank it up to like in a really intense level, almost like a science fiction kind of level, where it's kind of like worse than ever. And it's just kind of like this plague that kind of lingers in this city for months and months. So described in the book, it's way worse than it typically is, but it's a huge issue down here because, people, when the dead fish start washing up, it releases the kind of toxins in the air. People have trouble breathing. Nobody wants to go to the beach, obviously, because it just smells awful, and you start coughing and wheezing. So it has a huge impact on tourism. People don't want to come here for obvious reasons. And so it's been this kind of lingering issue that has been a problem here in Southwest Florida for decades. And I feel like it's intensifying kind of in recent years.
So your character is put in this proverbial hot water or red tide scenario. And then there's lots of twists in there. So tell me about your plotting. So you have this idea with the red tide, and then you have this idea with the placentas. How does all this come together?
Well, I was kind of the origin for the story was really a writing exercise I did in grad school, and the assignment was to close our eyes and take out a fresh sheet of paper. And she set a timer, or my professor set a timer for 2 to 3 minutes, and you just closed your eyes, and your hand had to keep moving for 3 minutes, and you couldn't. The idea was to stop overthinking your process, stop thinking too much about what you were writing. And during this exercise, I closed my eyes, and, my hand started moving, and I had this image of a young woman who was walking home from work. She's kind of there's this kind of howling wind, and she has kind of a coat that she's wrapped around herself tightly to protect herself. And she comes home, and she's walking from work. She comes home, and she encounters her father, who's sitting there smoking a pipe. And, in that 2 or 3 minutes, that's all I was able to get on the paper. But it was like, it came out of nowhere. I really had no idea where this image came from. And so in terms of figuring out the plot, I was almost kind of like working backwards. I was just so kind of captivated by this image. I was like, well, she's coming from work. Well, what's her job? You know, she's coming home to her father. There's some sort of conflict there. What's the conflict? And I was almost trying to like kind of fill in some backstory to kind of get to this moment or explain this moment. And the idea of like, I had, again, this image of like this wind that was howling, but I also knew I didn't want it to be, it wasn't like so anyways, I instantly kind of started thinking about red tide, just because like you kind of get this like wafting kind of like awful wind that kind of carries the smell and these toxins. And so that kind of set that part of it in motion. And the placenta angle, I was really just, I was thinking about the character, I wanted her to be figuring out some kind of way out of this like fate that she finds herself trapped in. And, I didn't want to do, something kind of cliched, like, I'm not saying it's all cliched, but I felt like I didn't want to do this where it was like some sort of like drug ring or something like that. And so I was just trying to think of something that was like a criminal enterprise that would catch people by surprise. And so that's kind of, I was really just thinking like, what's an absurd thing that could be being sold on the black market. So that's kind of like where I came up with that idea. But a lot of it is very just instinctual. I think a lot of, writers, they get asked like, where do you get your ideas from? And I don't know. I literally just don't know sometimes. And I think tapping into that is like, for me, is really powerful and much better than me trying to like logically, like kind of come up with ideas, if that makes sense.
I agree with you. The idea of tapping into something that we have no idea where it came from is just sort of sitting there. There's probably like a little filing cabinet in the back of our brain, and these ideas just float out and they pop onto the paper and like, whoa, where in the world did that come from?
Yeah, and I think like the challenge for writers is, your first instinct sometimes is like, oh, that's too stupid, like, or like, like I'm embarrassed by that, or I can't. That doesn't make any sense, and you have these kind of like your mind, tries to convince you like not to go in that direction, and I think sometimes you just kind of have to let go of that. And sometimes, sometimes that's productive, sometimes it's not. But I do think for me, like that's when I know that I'm really excited about something, is when it's like coming out of me. It's not something I'm like sitting down and trying to write, if that makes sense.
It reminds me, there's all these puzzles that are out there now. So if you go on, Facebook or social media, you see these ads for these. I do. Maybe other people don't see them, but they're targeting me. These puzzles that look really complicated to solve, but you keep staring at them because you know that there's a solution. So it's getting from point A to point B and finding that line that gets there without crossing over patterns and retracing your steps. So did you actually have the conclusion in your mind as you started to plot everything out? So it was easier to go and that way to see the beginning, to see the end and figure out how they meet, or was it unknown to you?
It's kind of a mix. I definitely was just like, the first draft came to me very quickly in a way that I had never experienced before. And so I did feel like I was just kind of like rushing through it, and I didn't always know exactly where I was going. But there were a couple things I had in mind, that I kind of knew I had to like resolve, but I didn't know exactly how that was going to work. And just as an example, like, so the main character in the book, like, she's kind of stuck caring for her father, because her mother has like abandoned both of them when she was in high school. And so I kind of knew that. I knew that there had to be some sort of, not necessarily a resolution, but I knew that had to kind of come to like a climax. This kind of conflict with like a missing mother. And so I didn't know exactly what that was going to look like, but I kind of knew that was like the vague direction that I needed to go in. And then once I got there, that's when I really started thinking about, okay, well, what does this actually look like? So I think it's kind of a mix, and I also think that for me, like in the rewriting process, like revising, editing, once you kind of know where that landing point is, then you can kind of go back and you can start working on the beginning kind of with that ending in mind, you know. So the first draft, definitely I didn't know exactly where I was going, but then once I did, it like that helped the revising process a lot, kind of going back and like sharpening everything.
Yeah, I bet it does. So, there's always the idea of layering the edits. You go through and when I write, I will go through the first time, I'll edit just the big stuff. I see a plot hole, I see really bad grammar, right. I'll fix all that stuff. But then I go back in and I layer in the textures. I layer in, all the senses and the things that bring it to life, the little nuances. And those come in at that later draft. And that's where you really start to shape, you bring that smell, for example, to life, where it's like, totally permeates the nostrils and it gets in your clothes and in your hair and you feel like you got a shower. But that's, that's what we do as writers. We continually layer our process so that we create a 3D version of the puzzle that we're creating with the novel. Do you read science fiction? Is that your preferred reading, recreational reading?
Not really. I do like it, but it's not what I typically go to. And in fact, I did not really read much science fiction until like the last 10 years or so. And I think what I have drawn from that is like world building. I think the way that they have to like build this whole world, but then you only see, it's like the iceberg, right? Like you just see the top of the iceberg, but there's this kind of like whole history. There's like, about how this universe operates. It's like happening below the water. But nobody wants to read like 50 pages of like explanation for like how the world works. And so you have to tell the story in a way that gives people like that little bit of like enough information to kind of explain why things are happening. But you can't just hit them with a bunch of exposition. And so I think that was the big thing like I've learned from science fiction is how to do that in a way that keeps the story moving forward, but also gives the reader enough clues so they can kind of understand the world that they're in. And I think that I think all writers face that. Like anybody who's doing fiction, you kind of have to. That's a challenge. I think for science fiction, it's harder because there's so much that like they might have to like explain that's different from somebody's everyday existence. So that's been really rewarding is kind of reading science fiction with that in mind.
I did make the jump that this is a science fiction book. Is that how you're categorizing it?
No, actually, I don't consider it science fiction, but I do think that it's, I could see, why people, like, I do think it's kind of like, I think it's drawing from themes that you might see in science fiction or techniques or styles that you see in science fiction. But no, it's not, it's sort of, the way I always think about it is like, it is kind of set in this kind of dystopian city, but it's not dystopian in like a futuristic way. It's sort of just like, every kind of like awful thing that could be awful is kind of just like cranked up, so it's not really, it's intended to be reflective of like a certain level of reality, with just sort of like some of the negative things like cranked up, basically. It's not like any type of like futuristic setting or anything like that.
I've recently heard of what's called a new genre, but it's that sort of an environmental science fiction. Mm-hmm. And there's probably a whole term for it that, I'm not aware of because I don't tend to read that unless it's done in a lighthearted way. It's just not my style. Yeah. But I hear that sort of the environmental piece of what you're talking about. Mm-hmm. With the red tide and it being one of the worst ones out there, and red tide is an issue. Anyone who lives in Florida will be, or anyone who lives on the Gulf Coast of Florida will be able to identify it. It's one of those you check to see if you can even go to the beach on that particular day. It's in the news all the time. But anyway, let's go to.
Yeah, I was just going to say. I'm sorry. I was just going to say. Yeah, like the term I've always heard is climate fiction or cli-fi instead of sci-fi, and people have told me that, kind of my book slots into that. And I totally accept that. I'm not an expert on kind of that emerging genre, but I do understand kind of why people would say that. And I think I think if people have read those kinds of books before, I think that they would recognize some similar stuff from my book for sure. Yeah.
Cli-fi. That was it. That was the terminology.
Yeah. Well, it's funny because one of my mentors in grad school, like wrote a blurb for the book, and that was the term she used for it. And, I had heard it before, but I guess had never really thought of myself being kind of like in that category. But, it fits. And so like, I personally need to like investigate kind of this subgenre a little bit more just so I can understand it a little bit better. But I think the book definitely is kind of in that vein for sure.
So tell me how you got started writing. I mean, you're a journalist. You've been a journalist for years and years. Obviously, you liked writing before you went to college. I would throw that out there.
Yeah, well, actually, so when I went to undergraduate school and I graduated, and I was just like, I want to be a writer, but like I had no idea what that meant. I didn't like know any writers. Like there wasn't like somebody who was like my neighbor who like could show me how to be a writer. So I really didn't know like how to become a writer or like what being a writer took. And I just had this very vague ambition. And so right away when I was young, I was like 22 or 23, I was just like, I'm going to write a novel, and like had no idea what I was doing. Like it was I was really proud of it, but it was like terrible, I'm sure, in retrospect. But like I learned a lot, and like kind of it was just really interesting to kind of like commit to doing something like that. And so I always had that. And anyway, so I tried submitting it and stuff like that, but it wasn't worthy of being published. And so I kind of shelved fiction for a little while. And I got into journalism just through kind of almost by accident. I was kind of working as an intern at a local alt weekly, just kind of covering like bands and kind of stuff happening around town. And I found I really loved journalism too, just the process of meeting people, interviewing people. All the techniques of like crafting a story are very similar to kind of fiction writing. And I think a lot of the journalism work that I've done, every little bit just kind of helps you sharpen your skills, even if it's something that is not like what you think of as a big important story or something that you're pouring your heart and soul into, like you might do with your fiction. Like every little opportunity to write something is just practice. And so I always, I kind of just felt I was getting better and better. And then finally, kind of decided I wanted to go back to grad school and do creative writing degree. And so that was kind of like my entree then into like being more serious about writing fiction again. And so that was kind of the path. So then I've been doing journalism and then working on the book at the same time. So, yeah.
Well, that's very, very interesting. Cooper, how can people get in touch with you?
The main way is just through my website. It's cooperleveybaker.com. That's Cooper Levey Baker.com. That's always a great way to keep in touch with what I have going on. I got some events kind of coming up around the book that people can check out. And then also like I'm on Twitter. I think that's probably the easiest way to get me is, again, it's just Levey-Baker. It's Levey Baker. And that's on Twitter. So please reach out to me there.
I imagine when, the next generation or 2 generations from now come around, like all the names are going to be taken. So, right now, it's so easy. I'm just Alison Nissen. So I was able to snag it when everything was brand new. I can't imagine what other people, the kids these days. I know I've encouraged my kids who are adults now, like, get your name, buy the URL of your name and keep it.
Yeah. Well, I will say, luckily, I mean, I think it helps not having, it's not BillJohnson.com or whatever it is, like it helps also having, just somewhat kind of atypical name, I guess.
Well, Cooper, are you ready to switch to our rapid fire questions?
I think so, but let's see. I'm a little nervous, but we'll see.
All right. Are you an Apple phone person or a different brand person?
I'm an iPhone guy. I mean, that was my first smartphone I got, and I guess I've just never like switched it up. I can't say I feel very strongly about it, but I also don't feel like I haven't had a reason to change. So I guess that's probably why I haven't. So yeah, I'm Apple for sure.
Do you like to write longhand or on a typewriter or a keyboard, I should say?
I actually love writing on a typewriter. But I've just found it just is a little too time consuming for me, kind of where I'm at in my life. And so I'm definitely a word processor guy now. The main one I actually used was just Pages, the kind of generic app that comes on Mac computers. That's kind of my go-to writing program.
And favorite holiday memory?
Favorite holiday memory? Was so funny. I actually just had to write a little bit of a story about this. I was going to say that my favorite holiday memory is when my wife, she was just my girlfriend at the time, she and I were kind of young and broke, and we went to like a party for her work, and we won like a basket of holiday ornaments, but we were so broke that we had never bought like a Christmas tree or anything like that. But we were like, well, we got these ornaments, so we should go out and buy a tree. And so we went out and bought like our first Christmas tree together, and it was like this scrawny little like Charlie Brown thing, which was like whatever the cheapest one on the lot was. And we had a very small apartment, so we didn't have a lot of room. But it was like just the right size for the space and like the 10 ornaments or whatever that we wanted this thing. So that's always been like something I've always like, we still buy a tree every year, and that was the first time we did it together. So that's a great memory for me.
Oh, I love great memories. They keep you warm and happy on the inside.
Totally.
Cooper Levey-Baker, thank you so much for stopping by.
Thank you so much for having me. I love the podcast and appreciate what you're doing.
You have been listening to another edition of the Florida Writer Podcast with your host, Alison Nissen. Alison out. Ooh, we're all done.
I love your like closing sound effect. That's great.
I've been practicing. Cooper Levey-Baker is a writer and journalist. His fiction has appeared in the Sierra Nevada Review and Burrow Press Fantastic Florida series, and his journalism has won multiple awards from the Florida Magazine Association and the Florida Society of Professional Journalists. Dead Fish Wind is his first novel. For more information, you can find him on Twitter at Levey-Baker, Leveybaker. For more information about the Florida Writers Association, visit us at floridawriters.org. Until next time.